And we're live. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Rock Radio on WICR Iona College Radio. My name is On Conway, and it's really good to be back on the air. And before that sounds too contradictory, I just said first ever episode and good to be back on the air. Should probably clarify a little bit about myself. I am a sophomore here at Iona College, but it's only my second semester being at Iona. I started at a college at University of Rhode Island, and that's where I first got into doing radio. And what I did there was basically just I'd make a playlist on Spotify, play music, talk every once in a while in between songs. And then when I got here to Iona, I got involved with WICR as soon as I could, just to kind of get myself acclimated on campus, kind of feel more welcome and do something kind of familiar in a new college environment after starting over as a transfer student. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to do the exact same thing I did there. I just kind of played music and didn't talk. And now we're kind of at the other end of the spectrum where now I'm just going to talk your ear off for an hour or so about rock music, as you could probably tell from the title, Rock Radio. Because music, honestly, not a very athletic person, not really competitive into sports, that kind of thing. So I latched onto music as a main interest and hobby pretty quickly in high school and college, and that's why I drifted more towards radio, because it was a good outlet to express that interest and get people maybe to care about it as well, or just even if nobody watched, it was good to kind of have that outlet only for myself. And so now that I'm able to do this, I think for me personally, there's no better way to start off this show than by talking about the most important band to me and my favorite band of all time, Oasis. And so I know when people kind of talk about their favorite musicians and their favorite artists and stuff like that, it can be cool to like create a story where you were able to pinpoint an exact moment in your life, or a turning point, say, where they kind of became the most important band for you. And sometimes that might not really be possible. It just kind of happens through osmosis, so you hear them on the radio over time. But I think kind of fortunately for me, and almost appropriately for me, for Oasis, I can't pinpoint one exact moment where this happened. It was actually visiting University of Rhode Island one of the first or second times I was up there with my parents, and at the time starting to decide I would want to go there, despite having transferred a semester later. But we were in the parking lot of this restaurant looking for a place to park so we could go and eat. It was really crowded. We were driving around in circles for about like 20 minutes or so. And we were listening to Lithium on Sirius XM, the designated station for 90s rock, which is my wheelhouse, my go-to genre. And at that point, I really only knew Oasis as the band. That they had Wonderwall, they had Champagne Supernova, and that was just kind of like my peripheral knowledge of them. They weren't really in the forefront of my musical interests. And they played on the radio maybe lesser-known Oasis song that I heard, and I had no idea what it was. I actually thought it was an REM song at first, because it had a very different sound to what I was used to associating with Oasis. And then I asked my dad, "Hey, this sounds really good. Is this REM? What is this?" And he told me it was no, it was Oasis. It was a song called "Do You Know What I Mean?" If you're a fan of Oasis yourself, and you know that one. And I just kind of pondered that. I took that into the back of my head and was really interested in that, and tried throughout dinner and then for the rest of the night not to really forget the name of the song. Because the second we got back to the hotel, I plugged in my headphones and I listened to it again. And it was like a door opened up onto Oasis that I didn't even know was there, that I'd be interested in. And from there, I just kind of dove further and further into their discography and got super steeped in their sound and the history of that band. You know, the Gallagher brothers, some of the craziest people in rock music, probably. And the rest is kind of history there in terms of my whole musical obsession as a person. I can kind of pinpoint Oasis as the real starting point for that, where everything kind of branched off in spiderweb from. So because of that, they're really the most important band to me, and I figured it'd be appropriate to dedicate this first segment of rock radio to them. And one of the most unfortunate things about latching onto an older band as a favorite and most important band is that you might not get the chance to see them, because they might be retired, they don't tour anymore, and in the more drastic case of Oasis, unfortunately, broken up. The Gallagher brothers, Noel and Liam, very much at odds over the course of that band's career, that got worse and worse to the point of a not fixable splinter between them, and the band was done. But actually, over the summer, I had the great fortune of seeing Noel Gallagher's band, Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds, open for the Smashing Pumpkins, and that was just really a special experience that you can't really put into words. Getting to see the man behind all the songs and the guitar work and this great music that kind of shaped your interest into what they are today. And not to put down that experience or take away any of the specialness of how I just described it. I would prefer to see Liam Gallagher. He's a bit more true in his music nowadays to what Oasis sounded like back in the 90s. As he says, Noel was sick of the rock and roll, and that's why he's got his sound now. But it was still a good show, and he closed with his set with about 5 Oasis songs that would just kind of made my night. I got to see Smashing Pumpkins, another great 90s band, and it was just a good time. But yeah, another reason I wanted to dedicate the segment to Oasis was because August of this year, so about a month ago, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of their debut album, Definitely Maybe. And in terms of them as a band and just music in general, specifically 90s music, that album really holds a special place in that decade and kind of carries some weight and kind of made them a powerhouse of that generation when most of rock music was dominated by 90s bands coming out of Seattle with the whole grunge sound, like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and everything that was kind of dark and dismal over there, kind of matched the mood of the city. And that's actually kind of why Definitely Maybe became super important and people kind of took notice of it, was because in contrast to that typical Seattle sound over in America, it had a very upbeat, loud, and a boisterous kind of bright sound to it. Noel Gallagher's even said in interviews that the hit single from that album, Live Forever, was written almost as a direct contrast to some Nirvana songs like I Hate Myself and I Want to Die and other such things that a troubled soul like Kurt Cobain was pouring out from a pen to paper and putting onto song. And Noel Gallagher just said, you know what, the youth doesn't need to hear that listening to music. They should hear, he's like, I want to live forever. I don't want to die like Kurt Cobain does. And so he kind of, in that song and the entire album, other songs like Rock and Roll Star and stuff like that, you can really hear the vibe and the feeling that Noel Gallagher was going for to oppose that darker, dismal sound of 90s American grunge rock. And, you know, as a person, really, I tend to disassociate meaning of songs with the sound of it. I know a lot of people will look at the lyrics of a song, and if they don't like the lyrics, they might kind of associate it with a bad song, even if it sounds pretty good. I'm not one of those kinds of people. If it sounds good, I tend to like it. Like there's a lot of bands where I care not at all for the meaning of their songs, like Rage Against the Machine, for example. Another 90s band who all the members are borderline anarchists, and I am not. As a political stance, I don't believe in what they stand for. And all of that, all their songs are extremely politically fueled, but I kind of push that aside because I think it sounds good. But another thing that Oasis kind of does for me that other bands don't is that I kind of actually did take interest in what their songs were saying. Not because I disliked the meaning of a lot of other 90s songs and thought, oh, maybe Live Forever and a Rock and Roll Star and these Oasis songs mean a lot more to me. But I thought it was an interesting stance to take that Noel Gallagher was so fueled by that kind of mood about music in the 90s to write that stuff. And then listening to songs like Live Forever for the first time with an actual open ear instead of just hearing it in passing as I was getting to know this band more and more, I kind of took a liking and took a special appreciation of like the lyrics and the meaning to that song. And not a lot of bands can do that for me. So that whole album kind of put them on the scene. They burst kind of out of nowhere into stardom. They're a band from Manchester. I know there's as I said, music was kind of dominated at that time, or at least in the alt rock and grunge scene by Seattle. But there's a little bit of a Britpop movement going on over there. They had competition with bands like Blur, you probably know from Song 2, or Big Time Rush sampled them if you care to know them that way. And very quickly, they were kind of shot to international superstardom. And they proved very quickly that they weren't just a one-off band that had this flash in the pan album that kind of went away. Their second album, What's the Story, Morning Glory, probably the album most people would know them best for, kind of proved that they didn't even start at the top of the mountain. They had more to do in higher places to climb. And you probably know that album even without knowing it, because Wonderwall and Champagne Supernova both come from there. And Don't Look Back in Anger, if you aren't a fan of Oasis and you know any songs by them, it's probably one of those three. So at this point, Oasis was kind of established as one of the bigger bands in the world. I mean, they never quite latched on in America as big as some of the biggest American rock acts did, like Pearl Jam and Nirvana, but in Manchester, they were basically gods. The Gallagher brothers were adored and worshipped everywhere, and their fans were out of their minds. And as the '90s progressed, this just increased more and more because they kept putting out music that was on par with the bar that they set for themselves with each album that they released. '97, they released an album called "Be Here Now." You can almost consider that as a mission statement by them, or a, we're here, we can do what we want statement by them, because that album was very unique in the sense that it didn't. Getting back to the meaning of Noel Gallagher's songs, a lot of the brightness behind what he wrote to start off Oasis's career. They didn't necessarily get away from that, but "Be Here Now" is an interesting album in the sense that a lot of the songs are very long. The song that I got into Oasis from, "Do You Know What I Mean?" That song's on that album. It's almost pushing like 8 minutes. All Around the World, another song that's pushing like 10 minutes, and all the other, even the shortest ones, are around like 4 or 5 minutes. And that's not really commercially maybe a good formula if you want to get radio play, because not everybody's gonna sit through a 10-minute song on the radio, but they did it anyway because they figured they could, because at this point they were here to stay and they had their adoring fan base that was only getting bigger. And lo and behold, "Be Here Now" is a really big commercial success, really well received by critics. Oasis had just been climbing the charts and climbing the mountain of popularity, and people just wanted more, and they got more with this album. And so by late '90s, early 2000s, they were on top of the world, to the point where now they could start changing their sound, which they did, be it because they wanted to experiment, and half that and half because I think personally that they kind of had to, with the way that the band was shaping up as time went on. Excuse me, still going through puberty apparently. That might happen a lot on these shows. You're going to have to excuse me. I'm going to have to develop a better radio voice. But yeah, come late '90s, early 2000s, after "Be Here Now," Oasis released the Master Plan, which is just a compilation of B-sides. And then in 2000, at the turn of the century, they released "Standing on the Shoulder of Giants," the first truly different Oasis album in their discography, I think, in the sense that it was more psychedelic and experimental with songs like "Gas Panic" and "Go Let It Out." Still, people received it well. Their fans were here to stay. They'd latch on to anything they released. And at the same year that they released this album, they released their first live album, a live recording from Wembley Stadium. And I'm not always necessarily one for live albums. I think they're great, but I think seeing a band live in person is probably the best way to see them. But this album is really something else, because whether you just find the audio and hear the massive crowd cheering for them, or if you watch videos of this very show from Wembley Stadium, where they just have a small stage right in the center, and then Wembley Stadium's an extremely large venue, so they packed as many people as they possibly could, and it was just filled to the rafters, and people were losing their minds because the English fans for Oasis were out of their heads for them. And so it was really just kind of special for me to see this clip from the year I was born. Obviously, I couldn't be there at the tender age of like 1 month or 1 day or however old I was when that album came out. But if I had a time machine and could go back and do anything, it might be to go to that Wembley Stadium show, because it was really something else to find that album and then find those videos and watch what they did and how the fans received them. But as I was saying, around now is when Oasis really started to change, because, every band over the course of their career will want to try some new things. You can't keep doing the same thing forever from an artist standpoint. I assume I'm not out here writing songs on the caliber of Noel Gallagher's songs, but I can imagine you're going to want to experiment and see what else you can manage with your skill. And also, there was an interesting dynamic going on in the band that kind of forced them, I think, personally, to alter what they were doing. I mentioned at the top of the show that Oasis is broken up. I think a lot of people know that because the rivalry between the Gallagher brothers is kind of infamous, and everybody really knows about it. Liam Gallagher, I think more on the surface, is the biggest hothead. If you follow him on Twitter, you see his tweets. Sometimes they're extremely incoherent, all caps, all signed off "as you were." He'll sometimes take pot shots at Noel for no reason on his Twitter. And as amusing as that can be on the surface, it's kind of disheartening because it really squashes any hopes that they might ever get back together. But this isn't just, this rivalry isn't really new. It always kind of been there, as is bound to happen in bands with many clashing personalities. And for some odd reason, it always seems like bands with brothers in them just can't last. The Robinson brothers from the Black Crowes, the Davies brothers and the Kinks, it just never really works out. And it's a shame. You hate to see that for family members to clash like that, especially if you're a fan of their music. they kind of take it away from you because they can't get over their silly feuds. But it was kind of more noticeable throughout the 2000s that stuff was going down on Oasis that kind of was a premonition to the end times of that band. I don't know if I can't claim to know if people saw it in real time because I was just a kid and I didn't even know who Oasis was, but it might have been obvious in hindsight. Liam Gallagher's voice was starting to get a little bit shot. He was living hard, doing lots of drugs, drinking all the time. I mean, you hear about that all the time with rock stars, and sometimes it really doesn't affect their voices and they can keep up with it. But Liam Gallagher had a very unique voice, very scratchy, whiny, kind of strained every time he sang all the time. And that's hard enough to upkeep on its own, even with good vocal care. But he would rather live that hard rock and roll lifestyle than care for it, apparently. So by their early 2000s albums, around like 2000 to 2005 ish, Don't Believe the Truth, Dig Out Your Soul, those were some of their last albums. The sound kind of shifted to a more I want like pulled back rock sound. It wasn't really, and Noel Gallagher even said himself, that wasn't really on par with what Oasis used to do. In certain interviews, he would openly admit to having written his best stuff back in the 90s with like Live Forever and Wonderwall and stuff like that. And he said rather than try and like fake it, he openly admitted that he's aware that he already got all his like best songs out of him. And he did the best he could do, but he still wanted to make music. So he didn't try to fake it. He just wrote what he thought he could do as the best for that given time. So that's probably why their later stuff is a bit less memorable, not as many hits. Liam's voice didn't quite sound the same, so you might not know at first you're listening to Oasis. The quality of the lyrics, if you believe in such a thing as lyrical quality, over time like that, like I said, I don't really care too much for meaning of a song, but I know a lot of people do. And so Oasis might have been in decline. They were trying to shift their sound a little bit to a more standard, blends in with the pack rock and roll sound of the 2000s. You could compare maybe to like Foo Fighters, who had just maybe doing the reverse, honestly, and adjusting that sound away from grungy stuff into more modern rock sound, but more successfully than Oasis. And it all kind of came to a head in 2009 when they were on tour for their last album, what would be their last album, Don't Believe the Truth. Noel was getting increasingly frustrated with his brother Liam's antics and just being in the band and living that lifestyle. Liam apparently claims nowadays that he's like sensed that Noel was going to announce his retirement from the band and abandoning the band leading up to it. And Liam kind of confronted him about this at a backstage show, and they really got into it. I'm sure they had a lot of unspoken dislike and contempt for each other at this point, but it came to the surface backstage at this one show. Noel claims Liam hurled a guitar at his head. I'm not really sure if that's true. If it is, it's a good thing that Noel ducked, because if he got decapitated by a guitar, that wouldn't have been a good look for the future of Liam Gallagher and his future musical endeavors. But Oasis was no more. And that was really a big blow, I assume, to their fans who remained dedicated over time. Retrospectively, it's a big blow to me because I would have liked to see them together instead of just one half of them, and not even the half that sounds more like Oasis nowadays, unfortunately. But it wasn't totally the demise of Oasis, because after that, Liam Gallagher and the rest of them kind of said, you know what, well, we want to keep doing this just because you don't want to live this life. We're going to go and do it without you. And they started a band called Beady Eye that was just really just Oasis without Noel Gallagher. And the reason they didn't keep the name Oasis was, I guess, partly to disassociate with Noel, and because he was such a big part of Oasis. And also Liam Gallagher said he chose the name Beady Eye because he wanted their CDs to be next to the Beatles and all the record stores, because Oasis probably wouldn't exist without the Beatles. The Gallagher brothers will both cite them as their biggest influence. And as I was told by a friend of mine who saw the movie yesterday, where that guy wakes up and he only remembers the Beatles because they didn't exist anymore or whatever. I didn't see the movie myself. Apparently, a minor plot point of that movie is other stuff stopped existing as well, Oasis being one of them, because Oasis probably wouldn't exist without the Beatles. And I thought this was kind of a shame because first hot take of rock radio, I'm not a big Beatles fan. I do think Oasis is better than the Beatles. I think Noel Gallagher said that himself once. He probably shouldn't say that, but I think it's true. So gonna have to go do a sequel to Yesterday where I'm the only one who remembers Oasis, and I kind of do that for them like that guy did for the Beatles. But I digress. BDI was not really much of a success because if you remove Noel Gallagher from the Oasis equation, you take away probably the biggest chunk of what that band stands for. I mean, Liam's voice was such a recognizable part, but Noel was the lead guitarist and the only really main lyricist for the band. So once you take away that signature lyrical style and guitar sound that he had laid out so successfully throughout the 90s with definitely maybe What's the Story, Morning Glory, Be Here Now, stuff like that, you really kind of take away the heart of what Oasis was. And so BDI was a bit of a short-lived project that didn't really catch on commercially. I think at that point, maybe people were just done with Oasis. They figured the band breaking up was enough. They didn't really have to continue with this. And so, much to the dismay of Liam Gallagher and the rest of Oasis, that kind of fell apart relatively quickly. And then for a while, it was really kind of nothing. Nowadays, they're up to their own things, and they've actually, kind of happy to and say for them, caught on with a lot of commercial success, or enough, not as much as Oasis might have had in the 90s compared to what they're doing now. But they both have relatively successful solo careers for themselves. Noel Gallagher's band, as I mentioned at the top of the show, who I saw live this summer, Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds, they have a little bit of a different sound than Oasis did because, as Liam Gallagher will be the first to tell you in an interview, Noel Gallagher was sick of the rock and roll life. So they're a bit less of a standard rock and roll band. They got a lot of interesting glam rock type stuff, more chill, experimentally sounds. And I mean, I really couldn't tell you any songs by them, unfortunately, but I saw them live and they were good. I enjoyed the segment of that concert that wasn't just Oasis covers. And Noel Gallagher still got it musically, singing, stage presence. He was talking to the crowd. He's still a great guitarist, and it was just good to see. I think Liam Gallagher's solo nowadays has caught on a bit more than Noel Gallagher has. All right. Sorry, I've just been told I should wrap up the first segment. I'll probably get better at this as the shows go on. When I come back, I'll just wrap this up a little bit with what Liam Gallagher's up to and a little bit of what Oasis might be up to in the future, and we'll be back in a few minutes.